Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most shocking and mysterious downfalls in modern history, the tragic final days of billionaire aviator and industrialist Howard Hughes. A man once known for his dashing good looks, groundbreaking achievements, and immense fortune, Hughes ended his life as a reclusive shell of his former self, weighing less than 100 pounds. But how did this larger-than-life figure end up wasting away in near obscurity, and why has so much of his tragic demise been hidden from the public? Stay with me as we unravel the truth behind Howard Hughes' dramatic physical decline and the scandal that has remained shrouded in secrecy for decades. Howard Hughes was the epitome of the American dream. Born in 1905 to a wealthy family, Hughes inherited his fortune from his father's oil drilling tool business. But rather than rest on his wealth, he became a relentless innovator. By the 1930s, Hughes was one of the most successful film producers in Hollywood, behind classics like Hell's Angels and Scarface. But his true passion was aviation. Hughes broke world speed records as a daring pilot, and his company, Hughes Aircraft, became one of the largest aerospace manufacturers in the world. He even designed planes that were ahead of their time, contributing to the advancement of aviation technology in both civilian and military sectors. In his prime, Hughes was not just a man, he was a legend. But behind the brilliance, there were dark shadows creeping in. As Hughes rose to fame and fortune, his obsessive nature also began to grow. He was notorious for demanding control over every aspect of his life and business. While this drive for perfection made him an unmatched businessman, it also sowed the seeds for his eventual downfall. In the 1940s, Hughes survived several near-fatal plane crashes, including one that left him severely injured. He suffered from burns, broken bones, and intense chronic pain. This marked a turning point in his life, as he began to rely heavily on painkillers, particularly codeine, but the physical injuries weren't his only battle. Hughes was also plagued by a growing mental health issue that few people were aware of at the time: obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD. His need for control started to manifest in bizarre behavior. Hughes became paranoid about germs, developed compulsive routines, and isolated himself from the outside world. By the late 1950s, Hughes had withdrawn from the public eye almost entirely. He moved from one hotel suite to another, keeping the curtains drawn and the doors locked. His interactions were limited to a few close aides, whom he trusted implicitly. These aides, known as the Mormon Mafia, controlled access to him, and Hughes relied on them for everything, from his meals to his medication. It was during this period that Hughes' health began to deteriorate at an alarming rate. His obsessive behavior worsened, and he stopped grooming himself, letting his hair and nails grow long. He became fixated on cleanliness, often spending hours scrubbing his hands raw, but paradoxically, he lived in filth. His rooms were littered with tissues and other debris. He refused to see doctors, believing that they were part of a conspiracy against him. What's more shocking is that even as Hughes' physical and mental health were spiraling out of control, the public knew very little about it. His aides ensured that his image as a powerful and influential businessman remained intact. But behind closed doors, Hughes was wasting away. By the time Hughes reached his final days in the mid-1970s, he was a mere shadow of the man he once was. He had isolated himself completely, living in a darkened room, subsisting on a diet that was erratic and lacking in nutrition. He refused to eat regular meals, and his consumption of drugs only worsened his physical state. Hughes had become addicted to painkillers, tranquilizers, and sleeping pills, which further contributed to his severe malnutrition. When Hughes was finally found in April 1976, shortly before his death, he was barely recognizable. At the time of his passing, Hughes weighed less than 100 pounds. His body was emaciated, his hair and nails had grown grotesquely long, and he was covered in sores. It's almost impossible to imagine that this frail figure was once one of the most powerful men in the world. But here's where the story gets even more troubling. You see, after Hughes' death, much of the truth about his final years was buried. His aides, the very people who had enabled his reclusive lifestyle, controlled the narrative. There was a concerted effort to protect Hughes' legacy, to keep the scandal of his physical and mental deterioration hidden from the world. Why? Because Hughes was more than just a man, he was a brand. His name was synonymous with power, wealth, and innovation. To reveal the truth about his tragic decline would have tarnished that image, and many had a vested interest in preserving his legacy. Corporations, politicians, and even the media played a part in keeping the darker aspects of Hughes' final years out of the spotlight. But beyond protecting his public image, there was another factor at play: money. Hughes had amassed one of the largest fortunes in the world, and after his death, there was a fierce battle over his estate. Various parties claimed to be heirs to his fortune, and revealing the full extent of his mental and physical deterioration might have weakened their claims. It wasn't until much later that the truth began to emerge, through biographies and investigative journalism. To fully understand why Hughes ended up in such a devastating physical state, we need to revisit the role that pain and addiction played in his downfall. The plane crashes that nearly killed him didn't just leave physical scars, they marked the beginning of a spiral into dependency on painkillers. For someone who had always prided himself on his independence and self-reliance, this was a bitter irony. Hughes' reliance on codeine and other drugs grew as the years went on, dulling not only his physical pain but also his emotional and mental struggles. While Hughes had always exhibited obsessive tendencies, the combination of pain and addiction exacerbated these issues. The longer he lived in isolation, the more these compulsions took control of his life. Over time, what started as a way to manage pain evolved into a toxic cycle of dependence that contributed to his decline, both physically and mentally. Another critical aspect of Hughes' downfall was his isolation. As Hughes retreated from public life, his connection to reality became increasingly tenuous. His obsessive-compulsive disorder, unchecked by professional treatment, worsened. The people around him, the so-called Mormon Mafia, enabled his behavior rather than seeking help for him. Hughes' aides were fiercely loyal, but this loyalty may have done more harm than good. They were the gatekeepers, controlling who could see Hughes and what information could reach him. Over time, they became the only people Hughes trusted, which created an insular and distorted environment. Their primary goal was to protect Hughes from the outside world. But in doing so, they inadvertently helped seal his fate. Without external intervention, Hughes was left alone with his fears, compulsions, and addiction. His obsession with germs became so intense that he refused medical care when he needed it most. By the time anyone could step in, it was far too late. Now, let's talk about why Hughes' tragic condition was hidden for so long. After his death, there was a concerted effort to protect his legacy, and this effort was driven by multiple forces. Hughes had become a mythic figure, a symbol of American ingenuity, entrepreneurship, and innovation. Revealing the full extent of his decline would have shattered that image. Additionally, the people who stood to gain financially from Hughes' estate had a vested interest in keeping the truth under wraps. At the time of his death, Hughes didn't leave a will, which led to years of legal battles over his immense fortune. If it became widely known that Hughes had been mentally unfit in his later years, it could have complicated these proceedings. The truth about his condition might have cast doubt on decisions he made during that time, opening the door for even more legal challenges. And then there's the broader societal aspect. During Hughes' era, mental health issues and addiction were deeply stigmatized. Admitting that one of the richest, most powerful men in the world had succumbed to such struggles was not something that people wanted to acknowledge. Society was not ready to confront the reality that even someone like Howard Hughes could be brought low by mental illness and addiction. So, what can we learn from the tragic final days of Howard Hughes? His story offers important lessons about the dangers of unchecked power, isolation, and the stigmas surrounding mental health and addiction. Hughes was a man who had the world at his feet, but in the end, his inability to confront his personal demons cost him everything. First, Hughes' decline serves as a cautionary tale about the corrosive effects of absolute power and control. Hughes was a man who had grown accustomed to getting what he wanted, when he wanted it. As his wealth and influence grew, so too did his isolation from reality. He was surrounded by yes-men who enabled his behavior, and without anyone to challenge him or intervene. He was left to his own devices, literally. Second, Hughes' story highlights the dangers of ignoring mental health. Hughes' obsessive-compulsive disorder, coupled with his addiction to painkillers, created a toxic cycle that went untreated for years. If Hughes had received proper care, it's possible that his life could have ended differently. But in a time when mental health was poorly understood, especially for someone of Hughes' stature, seeking help was not something that was ever on the table. Finally, there's the issue of legacy. Howard Hughes is remembered as an innovator, a visionary, and a larger-than-life figure, but the truth of his final years was carefully hidden to protect that legacy. It raises an important question: how should we remember public figures who suffer such tragic downfalls? Do we celebrate their achievements while glossing over their struggles, or do we acknowledge the full complexity of their lives? In the end, Howard Hughes was a man of contradictions. He was brilliant, yet deeply flawed. He achieved extraordinary things, yet he was unable to conquer the challenges within himself. His story is one of triumph and tragedy, innovation and isolation, power and vulnerability. As we reflect on his life, let's not only remember the legend, but also the human being behind it, the man who, in his final days, was brought low by the very demons he had spent his life trying to outrun. Thank you for joining us today as we uncovered the truth behind Howard Hughes' shocking decline and the scandal that has remained hidden for so long. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more in-depth looks at the untold stories of history's most fascinating figures.